a civilian national security force. We begin with a truism from one of America's great economists, Art Laffer. The great thing about experience is that you recognize your mistakes when you are making them again. We remind ourselves of this now that socialism has once again risen within the imaginations of a new generation of young and restless. First, we will dispel misnomers about socialism created by manipulative semantics and deceptive redefinitions. We will also back up our premise that China's was the purest form of socialism ever implemented, and we will attempt to develop an appreciation for the prevailing mindset of the Chinese people when socialism arrived. In doing so, we'll better understand how a socially developed and sophisticated society like China could fall prey to socialism's so-called charms. Let's first define our terms. We'll do this by considering the thoughts of two knowledgeable experts on the subject. American novelist, philosopher, and refugee from Russian communism, Ayn Rand, who spent her life advocating individualism and laissez-faire capitalism, said, "There is no difference between communism and socialism except in the way of achieving the same ultimate goal. Communism proposes to enslave men by force, socialism by voting. It's the same difference between murder and suicide." And in case one might still see some daylight between socialism and communism, author Will Spencer observed, "Socialism is communism before it gains total power. Communism is socialism after it gains total power." The other term that we need to establish a common understanding for is anti-fascism. This was best defined by Senator Huey Long during the American socialist surge of the 1930s, when he was quoted as saying, "When fascism comes to America, it will be called anti-fascism." China's experimentation with socialism was unique, with perhaps only Cambodia's killing fields coming in a close second in terms of fanatical purity of implementation. But China is not Russia. Russian civilization has only been around for the past 1,000 years or so. Nor is it Cuba, only half of that time, nor Nicaragua, nor Venezuela. China has been, for the most part, unified and self-governing continuously for the past 5,000 years. It has a unique cultural DNA from that of the West, and is a complex, sophisticated, and highly structured society. The result was a social cohesiveness and obedience to authority that played an important role in getting the entire country to lurch from one direction to another in its efforts to impose socialism. There were no half measures in China's socialism. China's independence, too, made it an ideal petri dish for socialism. China has the capability for self-sufficiency. They are tech-capable and have developed some of the history's greatest inventions. And considering its massive land area, China to a large degree did socialism on its own, as opposed to, say, Cuba, that had an outsized influence from the USA and Russia's Cold War, or Venezuela needing outside entities to run its oil production. No, China did socialism without outside influence for the most part, and was ruthless and single-minded in its implementation, and took 30 years to do it. China was therefore socialism's best chance. It's difficult for many of us to understand why a highly sophisticated, refined, and ancient society like China would allow such a foreign idea like communism to so virulently infect its society, especially among people known for their entrepreneurialism. But to understand why, it is necessary to put yourself in the place of the average Chinese person in the 1940s. The war against Japanese invasion, what the Chinese call World War II, began 4 years before Pearl Harbor, And the Chinese people's death, destruction, and suffering was on par and in many ways surpassed that of the Russians. China's death toll during World War II was close to 20 million people. The Japanese occupation was as brutal and cruel as anything that happened in Europe, and was one of the first proving grounds for germ warfare. The Japanese Army's Unit 731 weaponized plague and other horrendous diseases, killing off entire swaths of the Chinese population. Its live vivisections on conscious men and women and children and biological experimentation on live human subjects is one of history's darkest chapters. In 1945, China was starving, brutalized, and traumatized as a nation. But sadly, for China, it would be a journey from the ashes of one war back into the flames of another. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists began in 1927. This war never stopped, though it went into partial hiatus during World War II. But once the Japanese surrendered, the nationalists and the communists were back at it, and that war didn't end until 1949. The communists won, and by the time it was all over, the Chinese had endured 22 years of continuous war in their homeland. The period of absolute socialism in China can be handily divided into three phases that breaks out more or less by decade. The 1950s, where the Chinese Communist Party took total control of the country, picked its winners and losers, and began bizarre and destructive social and economic experimentation. The 1960s, where the massive failures and unmitigated disasters of the 1950s forced a violent and vicious power struggle that convulsed the country from top to bottom, shredding the very fabric of Chinese society. And the 1970s, for the most part, a wasted decade where palace intrigue simmered down, but ended with a change of power that led to China's first steps toward economic recovery and advancement to its place as the world's second largest economy today. So the 1950s and the communists offered a new era of hope and change for the Chinese people. Many Chinese had only known war their entire lives, and the promise of any change indeed brought hope. Everything was going to be different. This was a people's revolution, after all, and the party promised to put the welfare of the people first. And the kind of change that the communists promised was no less than a fundamental transformation of China, a refrain that was recently heard here in the United States.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
Though it was openly called for, and people eagerly celebrated the 2008 U.S. election victory of a popular leader who openly wanted to fundamentally transform the United States of America, it clearly didn't happen here. In part because of the incompetence of the people leading the effort, but mainly it is the American system of government that protected us, limited, divided, and decentralized, and our constitutional protections that blocked any irreversible moves towards socialism. But when the Communist Party of China took power, it was the one and only government with all powers centralized in their national government, with no opposition party whatsoever. They therefore had free rein to impose socialism at will. But make no mistake, any country, even the United States of America, could have suffered the same fate as China if they had the kind of centralized and unopposed power that true socialism requires to exist. What does fundamental transformation look like? Well, it begins with highfalutin promises. In China's case, it was "the party will provide" and was the biggest promise of the early revolution. The Communist Party began to take control of all aspects of Chinese life. There were party representatives at all levels of civic life. Competing social organizations such as religion were brutally suppressed or brought under the control of the party to serve its purposes. And yes, it was time to redistribute the wealth, as all socialists promise. Landlords were arrested, their property seized, and brought down, killed in some cases, and if not, forced to sweep streets and clean latrines in abject poverty until they died of privation or humiliation. Suicides were rampant. The death toll was reported to be in the hundreds of thousands and was likely in the millions, although accurate figures are hard to come by. And for the godlike Communist Party, having taketh away, it was time to giveth. Private land, all land, became property of the state, and rights to it was divided up among the peasants, with few objections from the peasants, of course. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party enlisted peasants to lead the effort to bring down their own landlords. The effect was unleashing a lynch mob.
Speak Bitterness meetings were held in which the landlords and others linked to the defeated nationalists were confronted and denounced by the peasants.
There was a denunciation meeting every day.
Hundreds of thousands were killed.
China's society was turned on its head, with the poor peasants ascending to positions of responsibility in the government, and the educated and experienced terrified into subservience and compliance or eliminated altogether. But for the Chinese people, times were still better than the war years, and for the largest parts of the Chinese population, life stabilized if not improved. Unlike dynasties of old, where palace intrigues occurred among the very top echelons of society, with the masses pretty much left alone, China's socialism was total and absolute. Yes, there were a handful of peasant revolutions during China's history, but you would be hard-pressed to find any that so thoroughly affected the lives of every single person in China the way socialism did. It told them where to live, what work to do, what to think and what not to think, even what clothes to wear. The Zhongshan suit, commonly called the Mao suit, was originally introduced 40 years earlier by the father of modern China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. After the communists took power, it increasingly became standard wear in China, and by the 1960s was worn by everyone, and became a symbol of unity and extreme conformity. The lack of gender distinction between male and female dress showed the Communist Party's willingness to even tinker with gender identity. And you could expect the party to decide not only what you wore, but what you would plant in your fields. Cabbage, for example, would be ordered planted by the Communist Party by unskilled and inexperienced bureaucratic planners. Consequently, when harvest time came, entire cities would be inundated with cabbage, stacked high on roofs, in doorways, and in courtyards. You didn't have to ask what was for breakfast, lunch, or dinner for months at a time. And if you were lucky enough to be selected for higher education, you were told what to study. If the party deemed that more marine engineers were needed, you studied marine engineering and liked it. And you even needed permission from the party to marry. Total control of the media was essential, and the very idea of a free press, let alone freedom of speech, was in and of itself counter-revolutionary. The party, socialism, and the revolution, those were the tenets of China's new faith. And any ideas or thoughts that didn't come from the Chinese Communist Party was tantamount to blasphemy. Parallels in modern America might include using unapproved words or terms in emails, or support for a particular point of view at work, like at Google, that gets you fired. Using banned gender pronouns in a college campus that gets you expelled or roughed up. Or being impoverished when advertisers withdraw, professional agitators boycott your business, or being sued into bankruptcy for practicing religious beliefs that offend protected minority groups. Christian cake bakers, florists, and photographers who refuse to participate in same-sex weddings, for example. It's worth noting that a complicit private media has the same effect on free speech as a state-owned media. Chinese propaganda campaigns were slick and all-encompassing. They inspired people to the Communist Party and its cause with glorified semi-fictionalized heroes. Learn from Lei Feng's good example. Every school child wanted to be like him. Orphaned during the war, he was taken in by the People's Liberation Army and raised up to be a model soldier and patriot. He was ultimately martyred in a banal work accident while serving the army and the country he loved. He demonstrated the party to be compassionate and humane, unlike the evil capitalists of the past who would have surely exploited him. One wonders how government could so thoroughly take control of the lives of 500 million people after 1950. Part of it was China's social cohesiveness and penchant for obedience before authority. But there were other factors as well. Gun control. One of the most insidious violations of the Chinese people's creator-given rights was the right to keep and bear arms. There is no question that the widespread violation of the civil and human rights of the Chinese people wouldn't have been possible had the Chinese people possessed firearms. Party leader Chairman Mao Zedong knew this all too well and never hid his intentions when it came to gun confiscation. One of his most famous quotes says it all. "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Our principle is that the party commands the gun, and the gun shall never be allowed to command the party." The Chinese Communist Party again positioned itself as compassionate, this time with gun confiscation, offering confession and rehabilitation when turning in your firearms as a way to get back into good graces of the party. The only positive aspect of turning in your firearm was that, like a protectionist racket mafia who offers you protection over your business or neighborhood, the severity of punishment in Communist China of the day meant that crime was so low as to be virtually non-existent. But like accepting protection from the mafia, that kind of protection comes at a price. And it was through these processes that the Chinese Communist Party did indeed fundamentally transform China. Who among us will dare to rise up against the DC tyrants who squabble for dominion over the rights, fortunes, and lives of the American people? Curtis Bradley is one of those revolutionaries. From the deck of the USS Hornet in 1942, to the mountains of Afghanistan in 2001, to the streets of Washington, D.C. in 2020, the Bradley family has fought against tyranny. After socialism steals Americans' most precious inheritance, their freedom, will Curtis launch the shot heard round the world in 2020 and rescue our constitutional republic? Find out in Tree of Liberty Trilogy, winner of Let's Just Talk Radio's Best Political Thriller Award. This 30-year sweeping epic takes readers on a journey around the world and across the spectrum of the human spirit. Visit treeoflibertyusa.com to learn more and get your copy. Tree of Liberty is available wherever books are sold.